They are authors of the new book, Nightmare Scenario: Inside the Trump Administration's Response to the Pandemic That Changed History. Thank you both for being on with us today. We really appreciate it. Damien, I'll start with you and the concept of the book. I mean, my estimation is that many believe that tens of thousands, possibly hundreds of thousands of deaths could have been prevented.
Absolutely. I mean, I think obviously this virus snuck up on the whole world, and there's no doubt there would have been deaths in the United States. But what we found where there was so many missteps, you know, for example, back in February when they were so obsessed with the cruise ships and the president had this idea to put people who were sick, you know, elderly Americans on Guantanamo Bay because he didn't want the numbers to go up in the United States. When he was focusing on those people, there were thousands of people flying into the United States every day from other countries with the virus. They were always steps behind. And so, you know, when they were trying to play down the numbers, there was this huge surge of cases in the United States, and certainly hundreds of thousands of people died that didn't have to if different policies would have been enacted.
Yasmeen, you have new reporting that's fascinating about President Trump's own case of COVID, how he went into the hospital, many people will remember, and how quickly he came out. And you go behind the scenes of this struggle to keep him in the hospital on the one hand, and the president completely refusing and saying, I'm going home. That's one part of this. The other part of it is the request from the White House for these experimental treatments, and doctors saying we cannot experiment on the president of the United States.
Yeah, so our reporting shows that the president was much sicker than was reported at the time last October, and he got access to what was then an experimental drug, a monoclonal antibody from Regeneron, that people familiar with his medical condition said was responsible for his rapid turnaround. Before that, his doctors were really concerned he was going to have to go on a ventilator. Some people were worried he wasn't going to make it out of Walter Reed. And so he did get access to this drug. And a White House official actually called the then FDA Commissioner Steve Hahn directly to get a special exception for the drug.
And so, Yasmeen, how bad was the case? We saw him come back to the White House. I think everyone remembers him landing and laboring to get up the stairs as he took off his mask. How serious a case was it?
Before that, it was a very serious case. The president at the time was in the highest risk category. He was over 70. He was medically obese. He didn't exercise very much. He ticked a lot of the high risk categories for a coronavirus patient, and he had to be given oxygen twice. At one point, his oxygen dipped into the 80s, and like I said earlier, his doctors had feared he was going to have to go on a ventilator. So before that, it was looking like a very serious case, and even as you noted before, when he left the hospital just a few days after he was admitted, his then physician, Sean Conley, didn't want him to leave. The CDC director at the time, Robert Redfield, called Sean Conley and said he can't leave the hospital. He's in the highest risk category. He could have a second backslide or some kind of organ failure. And Sean Conley said he agreed, but just could not convince the president to stay any longer.
Damien, Mike Barnicle's here with a question for you. Mike?
Damien, the reporting in this book is spectacular, interesting, and deeply depressing, given the level of incompetence that you report on. But my feeling, and it's still a strong feeling today, is that one of the most horrendous things that occurred during those first few months when people in America became alert to and victimized by the virus was the politicization of mask wearing by the President of the United States.
Absolutely. You know, I think one of our big targets for Yasmeen and I was to look at the inflection points in the response, the moments when things could have gone one way, but they went another way. And there's this really dramatic scene in the Situation Room in March when they finally agreed, yes, you know, masks can help. And so they had these U.S. underwear making companies produce 600 million masks. So they were going to send 2 masks to every American through the United States Postal Service. And so they had these, you know, masks made, and Secretary Azar in the Situation Room tried them on to kind of model them for the group. And, you know, there's this kind of, you know, frat boy humor. Oh, it looks like a jock strap on your face. Oh, it looks like a training bra on your face. And so they scuttled the masks, and the masks were never sent. Imagine, Mike, if they had sent masks to every American, 2 masks, and it was normalized, and the president had modeled it, and there was no division. It wasn't political at all. Imagine how the response could have been different. But they didn't. You know, the masks got shelved. It turned, as you said, it turned into this huge wedge issue. where either you were with the president and didn't wear masks, or you wore masks and you were against the president. And, the consequences of that were catastrophic. And still to this day, one of the worst legacies of this virus is how divided the country is, and how so many people don't trust scientists. They don't trust what they believe. And we're still seeing, a lot of issues, with the turmoil and the near civil war we had earlier this year. And it was all fed by this split last year that I think started with the masks.
So, Yasmeen, given all of that and given the political divisions that have erupted in the wake, I mean, they were always there, but were exacerbated by the pandemic and became focused on public health. I mean, every expert you talk to says there's going to be another pandemic. We're going to face this down again. What did you learn in the course of reporting and writing this book about what the Biden administration can do to fix that? And do you think that if there is another pandemic, that people will listen to our public health officials, or is the damage so bad that that's in question?
That's a great question. And I think so much of that will depend on how much time there is between this one and the next one, how much the divisions in our country might be able to heal or at least simmer down in that time. The thing is, what we learned was the U.S. was going to be probably behind in this pandemic no matter who was in charge. It was going to be an enormous challenge no matter who was the president. But there were political decisions and leadership decisions that exacerbated an already very difficult situation. So like Damian said earlier, if we had just all worn masks and it wasn't a political cudgel or a symbol of whether you were a Republican or a Democrat or tyranny or individualism, whatever it might be, that could have been very, very different. There are systemic things that need to be addressed by the Biden administration, by the next administration, across administrations. It's not going to be resolved in just a couple of years. And I think what we've seen from the Biden administration is they've tried to not be as divisive in their rhetoric. They've tried to model good public health behavior so that people know what to do. One of the big issues last year was you had the CDC and health officials issuing one set of public health guidelines and the president and some of his aides modeling something completely different. So there were just issues that became unnecessarily divisive.
So, Damian, the president obviously was downplaying the danger of COVID throughout 2020. Often saying it wasn't no worse than the flu, and it was constant. Talking about when America was going to reopen, and yet we found out in late summer 2020 that he had talked to Bob Woodward in early February. Let me say that again, in early February of 2020, and told Woodward on tape that COVID was easily transmissible and that it was very deadly. In fact, he told Woodward, from his understanding, it was at least 5 times as deadly as the flu. And so the question is, based on that president's knowledge and based on your reporting, when did the president decide that, despite the fact that he knew how deadly COVID was, that he was going to cover it up from the American people? Talk about what he said to Woodward and then the decision that was made to cover up just how deadly COVID was.
That's a great question. And I think that's something that Yasmeen and I struggled with a lot because, yes, in February, he did acknowledge to Bob Woodward that this is very deadly. And then, the next day he would say publicly this is going to disappear as soon as the weather gets warmer. We saw 2 very different Donald Trumps in our reporting. One was the one who was very cavalier, kind of said it was all going to be fine. I'm not worried about it. We're going to reopen by Easter. And then there was another one, the germaphobe Donald Trump, who was incredibly scared of this virus. When he was told by aides in the Oval Office that Boris Johnson had coronavirus and was being taken to the hospital, he thought Boris Johnson was going to die. He said, I have friends who have been put on ventilators and they don't come out. When his friend Stanley Chera in late March, 2020 was put into a coma and was in the hospital, and he saw the people in Gurney's and Elmhurst, New York, at the hospital, he was mortified about what was happening. And even, in October, late September, when there were people, Gold Star families were brought into the White House and the families were brought close to him, he got really upset at aides for having these people so close to him. He was worried about himself getting sick, but he didn't want to take any measures that would have necessarily protected Americans, especially as the second half of the year, got going. So that was one of the things that we really worked on in our reporting, was trying to figure out which Donald Trump was enacting the policies. Was it the one that was trying to brush everything off, or was it the one that deep down was a germaphobe and was very, scared himself about getting sick.
My God. The new book is Nightmare Scenario: Inside the Trump Administration's Response to the Pandemic That Changed History.